Welcome to RCast, the official podcast to the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete, concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. Each week on RCast, I'll be talking with the founders of our portfolio companies, as well as co-op members, staff, and other figures in the RChain ecosystem about the most pressing issues in blockchain today. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about the platform, our community, validator sale, and information on becoming a member.
First of all, thank you, Derek, for hosting, and thanks to Christian and Isaac for joining. We also have here in the room Pavel, and we're going to be talking about the second part of Towards a Living World. Since Isaac wasn't here for the first part, and other listeners might be wanting to catch up, I'll just do a quick recap. Essentially, I'm operating from a draft document that I have entitled Towards a Living World. The thing that I've been doing is to work at two levels. The work itself is in two parts, but it's also at two levels. So the two parts are elaborating a framework that plugs into what we've already got with the CBC Casper, so that we can do programmable liveness constraints. This culminates in a variant of the row calculus that allows us to make context be first class, and thereby give us a mechanism for expressing synchronization constraints as encoder-decoder pairs for an error-correcting code, and where the context is running those encoder-decoder pairs. That's the basic idea. And then when you make these context be first-class things that you can pass around, then that allows you to program the synchronization constraints as the protocol evolves, rather than having the encoder-decoder pairs specified for the entire lifetime of the protocol. And this approach to capturing synchronization constraints, it requires a few insights. First of all, we don't want wall clock time, because wall clock time it requires a lot of trust, and it also introduces a whole bunch of complexity. For example, like one example of the kind of complexity that one begins to deal with is if we wanted to run these protocols between satellite and the ground, we begin to have to deal with relativistic adjustments. The GPS systems today deal with these kind of relativistic adjustments. So that introduces a lot of complexity. You also have to put a lot of trust in your network time service. So that's a source of trust. So things could be hacked in the network time service. So between those two basic issues, wall clock time is a bad idea as a device for expressing synchrony constraints. So instead, we use this error correcting code idea, and then we allow the notion of wall clock time to emerge from the kind of synchrony constraints that we can express with these encoder-decoder pairs. That's one piece of the puzzle. So it culminates in a calculus, a variant of the row calculus, which I had originally called the space calculus, because names are now locations in the sense Connor McBride's notion of a location, or Uwe's notion of a location that derives from the notion of zipper. Names are pairs of contexts and terms, and that allows you to locate processes. But then, because we're able to show that we can also express synchrony constraints, then it's not just about space, it's also about time. And the programmability of the contexts gives you the ability to sort of have time and space be stretchy, right? So they can kind of bend and morph depending upon how the whole thing evolves. It starts to look very relativistic. You know, I just mentioned that we have to deal with relativity if we do wall clock time. Well, here the relativity is kind of baked into the system. So that's part one. And then the part two is reimagining the validator harness, and not using the metaphors of gas, but using biological metaphors. So using metabolic control and reproduction and adaptation. So those are the metaphors that we use. And so this next part is how to fit those two together. Let me stop there and just make sure that recap made some sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I see how, having this sort of native notion of time should be advantageous. And I wonder, maybe the performance, because it almost seems like you get something for free if you just tack on wall clock time. But like you said, then there's this whole trust issue. And of course, that's a huge issue in and of itself.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm wondering to have this thing, this notion of time come directly from the protocol itself. I wonder how that compares in performance to something like just tacking on a wall clock time.
So that's a really good question. Essentially, in terms of the protocol, it comes down to the cost of encoding data and decoding data for error correction. We now have decades and decades of experience with error correcting codes and how to make those efficient. We know where the trade-off points are for getting more error correction, what that costs in terms of encoding and decoding. So there's lots and lots of literature on exactly this issue. We can do a fairly detailed comparison between that and wall clock time.
Cool.
But it's a great question, and the nice thing is that we've set it up so that we can answer it with engineering.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I like to use math to be able to answer some of those questions.
Perfect. That's the best possible answer.
Well, exactly. So then, for people who might be coming to this later, I know it's a podcast, but there's a read-along text, which is this Towards a Living World document. So the summary of the first part is given on page 21. So error correcting codes and liveness, or the space calculus summary. It's as tiny as the row calculus, so it fits on a page to give the entire syntax and semantics and the structural equivalences. It's not on the page, but you could fit it on the page if you did it cleverly. So the main point is that the spec is very tiny. It's mostly self-contained, and for listeners who want to sort of see what the culmination is, they can just look on page 21. I also want to suggest that for listeners who are interested, the other piece of the puzzle that's worth taking a look at is the validator harness. And so that happens on pages 35 through 37. And it's all one piece of code, but in each of those pages, we sort of identify elements of the validator harness. One of the magic trick that happened last time, or that we walked through last time with Christian, was just that we started from first principles, how to write down lifelike characteristics. So metabolic control of activity and reproduction, so autonomous reproduction, like the splitting of a cell. And then finally, some notion of adaptation. And all of that is represented again on a single page with a single harness. So the metabolic control of computation matches directly with the token gas split that we see in Ethereum, or even in the RChain implementation now. And then the reproduction piece makes explicit an issue that we have been struggling with because it was implicit in the way we've been thinking about the validators structure, which is how many threads of validation activity are associated with a single staking identity. The reproduction part of the structure makes that explicit. So you know that you have some population of validator behavior that's associated with that staking identity, which and once you've made it explicit, then you can begin to put constraints on it. And those constraints correspond exactly with the notion of staking. So if you starve the harness of the resource, then you can either kill off the entire population of validator behaviors, or you can reward it dually and increase the population, or you can do something in between where you starve only a portion of it. And that range of possibilities gives rise to sort of slashing all the way to the bone. So for example, if a validator is equivocating, then you really don't want that behavior to continue. So you want to kill off that population of behaviors. But if the validator has, for reasons outside of its control, created an invalid block, for example, you might want to punish that, but not eliminate that kind of behavior. And then there's the notion of functional behavior, which we encoded into the framework. And here, functional behavior, thought of biologically, right? It sort of relates to, for example, I put a picture in the slides of a spider weaving a web. So that's functional behavior, even though it's related to how the spider feeds itself. But it's also an extension of the spider's perceptual system. We've all seen that. If you see a spider in a web and you touch the web, and the vibrations created by the touch ripple throughout the web, then the spider responds. So the weaving of the web is a kind of functional behavior. We can build that into the framework, and that functional behavior corresponds to the validator accepting client requests. In other words, running contracts. The execution of smart contracts is functional behavior. And so the launch point for this talk is an observation that I made in the previous one, where we first recognize that the validator behavior is not the only thing that needs to be resource controlled. So we also want to resource control the functional behavior, right? So when we start running that smart contract, we need to make sure that it only makes as much progress as there are resources that are provided to it. We observed that because of the way we had written down the behavior for the validator, we could just iterate that. So wrap the smart contract in another layer of validation behavior, which creates the metabolic control over the steps of the smart contract. So that again, it shows kind of the value of this approach. But now comes a really interesting trick, which is that we can create a fixed point where instead of just doing 2 levels, we do an infinite number of levels. We close up the validator behavior, this validator harness, with a reflective fixed point. So the equation on slide 38, so if P is our lifelike behavior, our validator behavior, then R of P is going to be defined to be P of S, and then where we would put the normal functional behavior, we put R of P. And so now you get this infinite tower of validators inside validators inside validators inside validators. So you can view this infinite tower as a tower of simulators, right? So the outer simulator is effectively running the inner simulator as a control behavior. So you could imagine running all of RChain as a Rolang program inside RChain. And then inside that, you run this other nested RChain, and inside that, you run this nested RChain. It's a kind of fun picture. It's a kind of Rick and Morty-like picture of the world as a simulation. So the teeny-verse and the microverse and that sort of idea is what's being expressed here. there's a bit more to it, and that's where we climb up to the second level. But before we do that, let me again stop and check in and make sure that Isaac and Christian, you've had a chance to grok what I'm talking about here.
Just for everyone's sake, would you mind reminding us how to interpret this reflective tower of behavior and how you impose resource constraints on it?
Yeah, so the reflective tower, you can think about it at any given level. You think of that as running RChain, right? So you have a bunch of these validator behaviors in parallel, and they're communicating with each other around certain client requests. So those client requests are to run something. But what is it that the client requests are going to run? They're going to run another level of validation. It's as if literally you have this nested notion of simulations. So you can think about a validator as kind of like a universal Turing machine. And what you do is as a part of your client request, you ship it a Turing machine that the universal Turing machine is going to interpret.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, what this does is it allows you to do this at infinite levels. It's very, very similar to the reflective tower of 3-Lisp that was defined by Brian Smith back in the day. But it's really, an infinitely nested universal Turing machine. And because each one of these is sort of metabolically controlled, at any given level, you have a staking token that is used to control how many steps in the simulation you're allowed to go.
So if you have two such towers in parallel and their outer levels are the same, if you go down a level or go in a level, are those connected or are they separate within each tower?
So if you have a community of validators, right, and each one of them has inside it a community of validators. Community of validators inside one validator are not connected to the community of validators inside another validator.
Yeah. But
that community of validators, they're all connected to each other and they can do stuff. Yeah, so it's a pretty rich, it looks like, sort of the blockchain version of the Mandelbrot set.
Yeah. But like if lower levels or inner levels need to communicate with inner levels of other towers, is that something that you would need? And is it something where you could go up to the...
You need. You could certainly arrange it so that you could do that, but then it gets even more complicated.
Okay.
But it's not needed. The relationship between level n and level n-1 is that level n-1 is controlling how many steps level n can go.
Okay.
Yes, how much of the simulation you can run.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first idea. And now the interesting thing, again, in terms of self-hosting, is that we can self-host the full row calculus. So again, this is the idea is that we're now nesting these universal Turing machines. And in fact, we can self-host any flavor of the row calculus. So in particular, there's a way to encode the space calculus in the row calculus, or there's a way to encode the row calculus in the space calculus. So we could rewrite everything that we've done in this sort of biologically inspired model of consensus in the space-time calculus, and then be simulating a notion of space-time at each level, right? So we have this lifelike simulator for space-time that is infinitely nested. There's an infinitely nested notion of space-time. I don't know how else to say it. I'm trying to find another way to communicate the idea. But the important point is that I've got this tower of simulators for the space-time calculus. And at the inner level, I'm simulating a notion of space-time inside the outer level. And that the outer level is providing a resource constraint on the simulator for the space-time calculus on the inner level.
So I intuitively understand, this infinitely nested business. Coming from like a purely mathematical standpoint, it makes sense to have infinitely nested things. And I guess for me, the thing that's kind of hard to understand is how this is actually all implemented on a machine. And
well, that's a good one. Yeah, can implement it on a machine, and that's exactly why I wrote down the fixed point equation.
Yeah. Okay.
So I can literally write this down in Haskell. I can also write it down in Erlang. But the important point is that I've given a soluble recursive equation.
Yeah.
So there's some domain equations which are not soluble. For example, d of x is equal to the power set of d of x.
Yeah. Right.
That's not soluble. You have to at least get off the ground. So, but this one is carefully constructed so that you have a guard around the recursion that allows it to be soluble.
What is that guard?
So the guard is the P constructor itself.
Okay.
So that's the one observation that we need in order to know that we can implement this in Haskell or Scala or Erlang. The next piece of the puzzle, though, is to sort of investigate some of the metaphors. There comes to be a kind of philosophical investigation that is of interest here. The first part of the talk was just the practical side. We build up this machinery, and the reason we're building up this machinery is to give a next-gen blockchain architecture, right? So our chain gives approximation 0, and then there's an approximation 1, which makes sure that we have this nice programmable liveness and improves the construction for the validators. And the two fit together, right? Because our chain is effectively just wrapping Casper consensus around the row engine. And so now we're going to wrap the Casper consensus reimagined in terms of this biological metaphor around not the row calculus, but the space-time calculus. It's just a refinement of the existing R-chain architecture with some spiffier gadgets. That's nothing new, nothing super fancy, but we notice that we can do lots and lots of things with those gadgets that are slightly harder to do as it was conceived. But once we have fit those two together, then it turns out we can look at some of the more mathematical or philosophical consequences of these constructions. And the first one is this nested tower of simulations. It's a kind of Rick and Morty contemplation, but it gives rise to some interesting observations. The first one I want to chat about is something that happens in standard model physics. And what happens in standard model physics, there's an implicit assumption that smaller equals simpler. And this assumption goes all the way back to 3,000 years ago, when there began to be this debate sort of between the continuists and the atomists, for lack of better nomenclature. Right? So the atomists argued that the physical universe ultimately grounded out into some collection of building blocks that could be assembled in various ways to get the complexity that we see as physical reality. The continuists said, no, it doesn't work that way. You don't have these sort of discrete building blocks. It can be infinitely sliced and diced. I want to argue that at least at the mathematical level, we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. We can build things out of discrete building blocks, but the discrete building blocks are not aligned with the spatio-temporal locality. So if you look at standard model physics, by the time you get down to the scale of the quark, you've lost a whole bunch of capacity for organizational complexity. And in fact, there's a general principle, which is as you descend in spatiotemporal scale, you also descend in terms of your capacity for organizational complexity, until finally you get down to quarks, and there's a very, very limited kinds of organizational complexity that is expressible. And so this is summarized in a slogan that smaller equals simpler. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. To me, this was an important insight. Until I wrote down these alternative models, I wasn't able to see that assumption. Until I could write a model that breaks that assumption and yet still was consistent and I could calculate with it, I couldn't see the assumption. But that assumption doesn't have to be true. And we just built a world where it isn't true. So we can treat nesting as the notion of getting smaller and smaller or bigger and bigger, depending on which direction. And in many ways, it doesn't matter which direction you associate with getting smaller or getting bigger. You know, you could imagine that getting smaller is going inward in terms of nesting, but you could also imagine that as getting bigger because you have to add more and more addressing information in order to find where you are.
Yeah.
So that they're dual to each other, and that's because you have this infinity to work with. But organizational complexity has nothing to do whatsoever with where you are in that nesting hierarchy. There's a corresponding question that arises. So Einstein posits something about information flow as related to the speed of light. So in Einstein's proposals, what we get is the speed of light is sort of like the clock speed of the universe as computer. You can't get information to flow faster than the speed of light in a certain sense. Now, quantum mechanics kind of breaks this intuition in a certain way, but there's something fundamental about how information flow is related to the speed of light. Here, if you break the assumption that smaller equals simpler, then there are weird things that you could do. For example, since you have this whole computational universe available to you at lower scales, you could consult that computational universe as a kind of oracle. You could say, hey, you down there in the teeny-verse, go and calculate this question for me. And from at my scale, it will appear to take a single computational step, even though when you go downward, you might take a lot of steps, and you might consult other oracles even further downward, which take even more steps. And in fact, who's to say where the bound is? And so there's an interesting question about how much information flow or how much computation can be done in a fixed computational step at a particular level of simulation. Now, does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm driving at?
Yeah, you're saying, like, is there a bound on the steps taken in some of these sub-layers that correspond to a single step in, I guess, just the original layer, right? Because you can go up or down from basically anywhere you are.
That's exactly right. So I want to argue that we can steal the principle of the speed of light as constant and import it into this setting and say that we only get to do finite amount of descent and reascent in a single computational step. That it has to be bounded. Otherwise, you can go do magical, miraculous things. Now, maybe the nature of the universe is to allow magical, miraculous things, turning water into wine and all kinds of stuff like that. But at least now we have a place where we get to impose a kind of notion of continuity. It says, if you relax this notion of continuity, then you are allowing for miracles. I also want to point out, and again, I'm not really facile with renormalization calculations, but from what I know about renormalization calculations, this bound on not being able to do infinite descent and reascent is close to what's going on when we talk about renormalization. Because essentially renormalization is getting rid of similar kinds of infinities, the infinities that you'd like to exclude from your calculations. There's a connection there. I haven't taken the time to go and elucidate the connection. I hypothesize that we can probably express notions of renormalization in a setting like this.
Yeah, I was about to ask, since on each level you're focused on resource constraints, it seems like there would need to be a similar constraint on the traversal of the levels themselves. That can't be taken for granted as infinite, because on the physical level, somehow these are being collapsed to a single computational level. It doesn't give you like the inception effect on time. If you go down a level, it's still going to take as long as it did if you did it in the top level.
Yes, exactly. Or rather, it's not so much that it has to take as long, but we want to be able to record a notion in which we can impose that kind of constraint, because our intuition about reality, at least currently, suggests that that's the way things operate.
Yeah.
But we don't know, right? We're still working it out.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, what's interesting about this framework from a philosophical point of view, apart from its practical applications, and I keep wanting to stress that there are very practical applications of the mathematics that I've been laying out. It has these philosophical implications that are pretty striking, right? So it uncovers this assumption that smaller equals simpler, which does not have to be the case. And it also uncovers a new meaning to the kind of speed of light, the intuitions behind the speed of light constant. Another piece of the puzzle or another aspect of physical standard model physics that it begins to challenge is this idea of certain kinds of symmetries. In particular, in standard model physics, again, just from my naive understanding of it, I'm not a physicist and don't play one on TV. If you have a physical situation in which you've got an electron, in one location, and another electron in another location, and if you preserve all their properties, if you can swap them and preserve all their properties like spin and if they're in this situation where you can do that, the two sort of resulting universes in which they're swapped are the same universe. There's no observation or measurement that would be able to detect that you've done this swap. So this notion of swapping is very akin to fungibility in economics. If Christian has $1 and Isaac has $1, if they swap their dollars, you haven't changed their economic universes. From the point of view of their capacity as economic agents in the U.S. or global economy, it doesn't matter if Christian has somehow marked his dollar in a certain way, as long as it's still spendable. Even though the dollars are distinguishable either by a mark or a serial number, your economic capacities are the same, and so the economic universes are the same. So these kinds of symmetries are fundamental both to standard model standard model physics and certain aspects of economy or economics. However, in this new setup, you can break those symmetries. So in particular, you can imagine that our notion, since we no longer have this smaller equals simpler assumption playing around, you could have electron-like computers or programs, I guess is the better word, that for all intents and purposes look the same. So at a certain degree of bisimulation, or if we conduct a bisimulation calculation with observations that are resource bounded, though our observations are only allowed to use probes up to a certain amount of resourcing, then we can't distinguish them. Mm-hmm. But if our observations are allowed to vary in terms of resources, then we can distinguish them.
Interesting.
So one way to think about this is that these electrons might be subject to evolutionary pressure, right? So they're under constant adaptation. And the way in which we affect evolutionary pressure is by measurement. So we're constantly measuring properties of these things. If the measurers are far enough away in terms of levels from the things that they're observing, then those observations could result in millions and millions of inner generations for these electron-like things. Since there's so much iterations from the scale of the observer, they look and feel or appear to be the same entity computationally, when in fact they are not. And as a result, you get a contextualized notion of symmetry. It's symmetry up to how much resources you can spend to distinguish them.
I mean, in practice, what's an example? What are we thinking about as fungible versus distinguishable?
So I'm arguing that we might not have a fixed set of types of particles.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean in our chain.
In terms of our chain, this would be like saying that two different smart contracts look like they could be substituted for each other if you don't account for the cost of going inward by so many levels.
Okay.
Right? If you're willing to ignore or only put a fuzzy bound on how far inward they could go, then they appear to be bisimilar.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you swap them, but the inner universe has different, the corresponding levels that they get swapped to, or sorry, not levels, but validators that they get swapped to have different resourcing with respect to going inward, then they won't necessarily work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's kind of the idea. The analogy to physics is that now we no longer have a finitary set of particles. There's now an infinite zoo of particles, but it doesn't mean that we have to leave behind a notion of a crisp classification. So this is where the ladle types come in. So we can now start using our ladle types to describe and classify computational behaviors. But the classification is set up to deal with the fact that we now have an infinite zoo of things. We just get to get better or more refined classifications. We refine the types, which was the other aspect of what I was talking about in the previous talk, right? So Isaac, you weren't here, but I showed that we can do a notion of genetic algorithms inside the row calculus, because the code of a process to a process, the code of P is to P as genome is to phenome.
Mm-hmm.
This can be made very, very precise. So, for example, I went over, the sort of rough ideas of what genetic algorithms are and how they're applied to the generation of programs and give rise, therefore, to genetic programming. And I showed that for all, bipartite term constructors in the row calculus, we can define crossover operators.
Yeah.
Because ladle turns every term constructor into a type constructor, we can also do the genetic algorithms at the type level. And so now we can do these kind of two-level search algorithms where you propose a type and then you propose a term that is an inhabitant of that type that maybe doesn't fit some search criteria, right? And so that's the counterexample. So then you refine the type to eliminate that class of terms. And you iterate, you go through that process. So you're now searching, you're searching feature space both in terms of types and in terms of terms, which is an incredibly powerful thing. The example I used with Christian, as a mathematician, inwardly, my inner dialogue is divided into two parts, right? I've got a player or proposer side that's proposing a type, this must be true, right? The type is like a theorem. The following is true. And then another part of my mind, the opponent part or the opposer part, is saying, but what about this counterexample, right? So that's the term side. And then the proposer responds to that by refining the proposal, right? And back and forth until I find the construction that matches the thing I'm searching for. This computational framework that I've laid out in these talks supports that process. And the reason I'm talking about particle physics in this context is because if we jettison the idea that there's some finitary collection of building blocks, right? Maybe there's an infinite collection of building blocks. It doesn't mean that we have to lose good, crisp boundaries in terms of classification. We still have incredibly powerful tools for classifying things. And not only do we have tools for classifying things, but they fit into a framework that allows for genetic evolution of our classification schemes according to some, selection criteria.
In Ladle, term constructors in the row calculus or the space calculus don't explicitly reference reflection itself. And so if you already have some reflective tower in place, how do you implement types in Ladle that describe this sort of level boundedness that you were talking about, that a certain process can only go so deep?
That's a great point. The term constructors do reference the reflection. In fact, that's an interesting aspect of the whole row construction in general, is that it's carefully crafted. One of the distinctions between the row calculus and an alternative that Matthias Radestock considered is that I have a very, very careful discipline. There's a strict alternation between name constructors and process constructors.
Mm-hmm.
And this corresponds precisely to the player-opponent game theoretic construction that I was talking about in terms of my own inner dialogue. There's a notion of alternate gameplay built into the syntax of the row calculus, and that's utilized essentially, right? There's a critical point where that's utilized in the proofs of the well-foundedness of alpha equivalence in the row calculus. You need that alternating property or things go wrong. But and I mention all of this as context and background to address the fact that the @ sign does in fact give you a notion of level. So you do have a term constructor for reflection, and you have a term constructor for, so reflection is reification. Now let me put it a different way. The standard terminology is the @ sign is reification, and the star is reflection. But remember that we're doing, in our calculations, we're not just looking at that notion of level. We're looking at the notion of level as instantiated in terms of whether you're functional behavior or you're the outer harness. And that is easily syntactically covered as well. So we're able to detect that in a type-like way, and I actually wrote that down on slide.
Yeah, I just feel like there's so much fascinating math when it comes to this tower.
Oh yes, exactly. It's a lot of fun, right?
Yeah.
It's a big space to go and explore. In terms of this type idea, it also is we mentioned it last time, but it bears repeating that you can, since types give you a notion of query, right? So the basic idea for types as query, suppose I have a repository of source code like GitHub. And I could use a type to query that repository by simply asking for all of the programs in the repository and type checking them against the type. And those that do type check are the ones that are returned by the query. They answer the query. So that's a kind of brute force way. There's lots and lots of optimizations that can be done. But so because types form a query mechanism, we can imagine that we use types two different ways. You can use them as a compile time phenomenon. So you write down validator harnesses which are only willing to accept client requests. At compile time, you know that they will only accept client requests for contracts that type in a particular way. And everything else will just not even be considered. And you know that before you ever start the validator code. But you can also do this at runtime. So you can write a validator that is searching for the client requests, for deployments of smart contracts that match a particular type, and nothing else will it pick. So that allows you to write validators that are much more constrained, much more picky, and thereby give you a much more refined and interesting marketplace, at least in my opinion. That then feeds into these philosophical considerations. So I've been just yammering away, and we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I just wanted to hear from you guys as to your thoughts, having been exposed to these ideas.
So you were talking about having different validators that can pick contracts to run just based on the type. And I guess the first thing that I think of is like, oh, well, you're talking about that gives a sort of a richness to the different types of validator behavior. And it's like that immediately makes me think of, you can just have services that will, validate contracts of a certain type, and then there can just be a whole plethora of these different services just based on like certain types of contracts that they would run. So you can definitely see how that expands kind of the expressiveness.
Exactly. I think to me, it feels like that this is it's not just a nice to have in terms of trying to build out, a computational framework that's practical. This is a must have.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And to the best of my knowledge, there's not a single smart contracting platform out there that has anything like this, that has even contemplated this level of functionality. And we can write it down very specifically. What about you, Christian?
What I'm wondering right now is a lot less practical, and just thinking about this tower, I'm just wondering about the logistics. If you make one process reflect in itself ad infinitum, how do you describe taking a process from outside and placing it inside that process at an arbitrary location? I feel like I have a bunch of similar questions about how towers communicate and that kind of thing, and I feel like the answer is that context and how everything is structured in the space-time calculus, just the actual syntax, everything is always being like accounted for within these contexts, and all you have to do is zoom up or zoom down.
That is precisely yes, that's the whole idea. Yeah, you got it. I want to provide one last little point. I'll just read it from the document Towards a Living World. It talks about my own philosophical motivations for working at this second level. The basic idea is that the conceptual framework of physics makes it very difficult to fit life in. In the language of physics, we don't recognize the purpose of a planetary orbit or the gravitational effects of a star. We don't use the language of telos or purpose. By the time we get to biology, it's almost impossible not to speak about purpose, right? So when you look at the immunological response to a viral infection, you have to use the language of purpose, or the language becomes really awkward. And I want to sort of take on board that the purpose is part and parcel of life, our conceptualization of life. Life means purpose. And I just want to suggest that there's probably not an accident that if the dominant metaphors of the scientific culture are lifeless and purposeless, if our scientific ruminations and our scientific conceptualization of the world is of a universe that is lifeless and purposeless, that framework of thought might play a role in our culture's headlong descent towards a lifeless planet, right? If you ever go whitewater rafting or kayaking, you kind of notice right away that your boat goes where your attention is. And so if your attention is riveted to a lifeless and purposeless universe, that might be where you'd head. And so kind of in the same way that we need something like scalable blockchain technology to conceive and manifest a way of coordinating ourselves with the speed and agility that's required to escape mass extinction, I think we also need a headspace, right? A conceptual framework, something like a roadmap towards a living world. And so I want to argue that it might very well be that we never had to try to get life to emerge out of lifelessness. Maybe life was the ground to begin with, and that it was life that begets life. This work is sort of a work towards that roadmap of, because I think actually the mathematics of a living world might be richer. Like, in order to step into a living world, we don't have to jettison scientific rigor or accuracy or precision of thought or precision of discourse. And in fact, it might be the other way around, that if we include life into our computational and calculational framework, that it's just a lot richer. It's more fun. Sort of that's what motivates this other level of work.